According to maritime laws, the maximum number of passengers allowed on board a ship is comparable to the maximum number of people allowed at a social gathering. Simply put, there needs to be 8 square feet of space per individual, so if you are planning to invite 100 people to a party, the room must have at least 800 square feet of space. This is difficult for some people to envision, so a draftsman would create an illustration to demonstrate the concept. Drafting is a form of communication, whereas if you were told to draw a box, you might show a cube like this. A draftsman has to let the manufacturer know how much material is needed, so he would draw a box like this. Therefore, to communicate the square footage required per person, the draftsman would draw people lying down to make it easy to convert the numbers, visually. A rectangular space, 6 feet long by 16 inches wide would represent the 8 square feet allotted to each person. This slave ship diagram was drawn specifically to demonstrate those calculations. These illustrations were never meant to describe the actual living conditions on board. Just as a room, filled to maximum legal capacity allows plenty of space to move around or sit comfortably at a party, a ship, filled to maximum legal capacity, allows plenty of space to move around as well. The actual conditions during the voyage look more like these paintings. Movies tend to depict the slaves shackled below to mimic the illustration shown previously. How then, were they supposed to be fed? Hollywood typically shows a crewman walking down the center aisle, passing out cups of rice to the slaves. But as you can see, there is no center aisle in the first illustration. And if a ship had 250 slaves, it would take 16 gallons of rice to give each man just 1 cup. Trying to carry 16 gallons of rice through a dimly lit hull, stepping over human bodies would be an impossible task. So it is not to be believed. Some may argue that the slaves were treated like animals. But you wouldn't keep your horses locked in the barn while you tried to plow your field by hand. So instead of keeping them locked below, healthy slaves would be given tasks aboard the ship, such as cooking, serving meals, cleaning, pulling sails, or even keeping watch for hostile vessels. This diagram of a slave ship's maximum capacity has led to just one of the many misconceptions we will cover in this look back at the history of the United States. I will also attempt to explain why we have been misled. Part 1. Crossing the Atlantic. This wooden ship was not meant to carry passengers, so people were crammed into the cargo hold below deck. During the 66-day journey, the people had to sleep on wooden pallets. There were no bathrooms, and the ship leaked during storms. Many people became sick, and some died of malnutrition or disease. The ship I just described was called the Mayflower. I wanted to point out how crossing the Atlantic was difficult for everyone, not just the slave ships. Stories regarding slave ships often include descriptions of slaves held in chains. Other stories describe revolts, causing the crew to defend themselves with guns. Uprisings such as these would result in a loss of the precious human cargo. But there is another narrative which contradicts these stories. A sea captain would buy the slaves from Africa, and sell them in America. He would insure his voyage against any loss of human cargo. But that provides him with an opportunity to retrieve money he didn't spend. The captain would purchase only enough slaves to fill half his ship. Then he would bring sick or dying men on board, at no cost, to increase the head count. They would die during the journey, and be thrown overboard. The captain would mark it down as a loss, knowing the insurance would reimburse him. Eventually, the insurance companies learned about this practice, so they no longer covered any losses due to illness. They would only pay if an unfortunate incident occurred during the voyage, such as a revolt or uprising. Suddenly there were a lot of stories about slaves attempting to take over the ships, and the insurance companies were forced to pay again. The captains would claim the slaves were shot and thrown overboard. Soon, the insurance companies would demand proof that the captain took precautions to prevent a slave uprising. So the captain would keep shackles and chains in a storage cabinet, and only bring them out to prove he locked the slaves down below deck. The insurance company would say, "But this is your 3rd uprising this year. How is this possible, if the slaves were chained below?" To which the captain would reply, "We unlocked them, and brought the slaves on deck so they could dance. That's when they turned on us." This is such an unbelievable story. It is why I have become skeptical about some of the history we have been told. In fact, the more we learn the truth, the more ridiculous the stories become. I just recently read a story, claiming some slaves would refuse to eat, so the evil captain would pry their mouth open and force feed them. The article includes a picture of the tool they claim was designed for force feeding. The idiocy is laughable. If it's nearly impossible to maneuver through the crowded hull to feed the slaves, then how can you know who is not eating on purpose? And who is going to crawl over the bodies just to give special attention to one guy, and stick a gynecologist's tool in his mouth and force feed him? I will even suggest that some African body art was misrepresented as branding, conducted by evil white men. But when is the last time the name of a cargo ship was stamped on something you bought from overseas? And why didn't the Pilgrims have the letter M branded into their flesh, to prove they arrived on the Mayflower? Part 2. The Atlantic Slave Trade. America was responsible for her own involvement in the Atlantic slave trade, since her independence in 1776. Any references before that time could easily be blamed on another country. Northern shippers, headquartered in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Washington, D.C., controlled import and export of cargo for the United States. They were also responsible for the human trafficking across the Atlantic. In 1787, South Carolina's legislature voted to ban the import of African captives for the purpose of slavery. The North ignored this ban for 20 years. Then in 1807, they finally announced they would abolish the Atlantic slave trade in 1808. That year, there was an increase of slave ships, bringing African captives into the U.S. before the timer ran out. Even though South Carolina opposed the practice, Northern slave ships blatantly sailed into the port of Charleston, where the slaves were auctioned, and transported to states such as Louisiana, Mississippi, Georgia, etc. So once the Atlantic slave trade was abolished, do you think the Northern slave traders closed their doors? No. They simply shifted their focus to the domestic slave trade. Human trafficking continued, as the slave traders bought individual slaves from Maryland, Delaware, and Virginia, then sold them to plantations in the Deep South. From 1808 until 1860, families were separated simply for profit. This is the time period in which you hear the worst stories regarding slavery, family separation, and black people being put in chains and sold, downriver. The South wasn't to blame. These were the actions of human traffickers of the North. Even free blacks, living in the North, were kidnapped and sold as slaves, as depicted in the movie, 12 Years a Slave. The main motivation for this was greed. The North was not a self-sustaining economy. It could not function through capitalism. It relied on socialism to survive. Capitalism is a success or failure based on an individual's efforts in a free market. Socialism requires government interference. The South made its money independently, selling cotton to Europe. The North produced goods that were inferior to European manufacturers, so they had a difficult time exporting them. Even the South preferred to buy foreign-made goods. Instead of offering better quality, lower prices, or faster delivery, the North relied on government-imposed tariffs on goods imported from Europe. The money, extorted from the South, funded the economy that captured Africans and sold them into slavery. At first, this tariff was around 11%, but that wasn't enough to prevent the South from continuing to buy goods from Europe. So the tariff increased to 20%. The South complained, and attempted to conduct its own shipping, but in 1833, President Jackson signed the Force Act, which gave the Army authority to disrupt the South's attempts to avoid tariffs and trade directly. When warships threaten cargo ships, this is known as piracy. Vice President John C. Calhoun resigned his position in order to fight for the South. With the help of Henry Clay, a compromise was offered, whereas the North would reduce the tariffs over a period of 10 years. However, the North ignored this agreement, and the tariffs continued to increase, eventually peaking at 48%. The North also declared that any attempt to avoid the tariffs by a U.S. state would be considered an act of treason, giving them an excuse for a military invasion. The only solution was for the South to declare sovereignty and secede from the Union. That way any Northern attack would be aggression, and not a defensive reaction to treason. An unprovoked military invasion would be viewed as an immoral act of tyranny. Part 3. Secession. After seceding and declaring themselves sovereign in 1860, South Carolina demanded that the Union Army must vacate the forts surrounding Charleston Bay. After all, the Northern Army was no longer protecting Charleston's ports, but rather acting as a captor, holding Southern cargo ships hostage. Abner Doubleday, the man credited with inventing baseball, was a Union officer at Castle Pinckney. He once commented that they were so close to Charleston, they could easily lob mortars into the city. Does that sound like they were protecting the ports, or threatening them? Fort Sumter was nearly completed when Major Robert Anderson snuck in the middle of the night with 2 companies of soldiers. That translates to 300 or 400 men. They were ordered to vacate, but refused to move for another 2 months. Finally, Southern militia spotted a Northern ship, the Star of the West, bringing reinforcements to Fort Sumter. The Confederate militia fired at the ship, loaded with 200 soldiers, munitions, and supplies, forcing it to turn back. Then they fired on Fort Sumter to drive the Union Army out. Today, historians blame the South for starting the Civil War, saying, they fired the first shot, but the aggression was already initiated by the North. So the North was about to lose its tariff money. It had just lost the income it generated through the domestic slave trade, and was no longer benefiting from the Atlantic slave trade. So in 1861, Abraham Lincoln created the federal income tax. Any worker earning over $800 would be required to pay the Union government. At the time, Northern factory workers earned only $450 per year, and would still earn less than $750 as late as 1920. So who would pay taxes as a wage earner? Southern blacks. If Lincoln had actually freed the slaves, and allowed them to migrate into northern states, he would have to pay them before he could tax them. Plus they would have to earn nearly twice as much as the average factory worker, just to be taxed. So he intended to keep black people in the South, so he could tax them without having to pay them. Lincoln's plan was to rename the slaves sharecroppers, and allocate 1/3 of a plantation's earnings as their share. Allow me to reveal the math. A typical plantation made $150,000 per year selling cotton. 1/3 of that, or $50,000, would be listed as the workers' share. If a plantation had 50 slaves, that comes to $1,000 per man. This easily surpasses the $800 minimum required to pay the federal income tax. So once again, the South would be paying money to the North. Part 4. Freeing the slaves. The federal government needed to label Southern blacks sharecroppers to burden them with the new taxes, so Lincoln began a strong campaign to free the slaves. By spreading propaganda, he would gain emotional support for his apparently humanitarian effort. With the help of Uncle Tom's Cabin, a book of fiction, Lincoln accused Southerners of abusing black people. The North began to circulate political cartoons, showing slaves cowering in fear, while white plantation owners stood over them, cracking whips. It's doubtful that cracking whips would be an effective means of controlling an entire population. If it were true, then riot police are wasting money on rubber bullets and pepper spray. All they would need to do is crack a whip, and the crowd would disperse. But in real life, the whip cracker would probably be attacked, which proves my point. Those stories of abuse had to be false. One widely circulated claim of abuse involves a photo of a former slave named Gordon, also known as Whipped Peter. This medical photo was a study of a skin condition known as keloids, which is a type of excessive scarring. When kelotic skin is cut or scratched, the resulting scars are enormous. Here are some photos of patients who became scarred in a similar way from cuts, abrasions, and even scratching the itch associated with chicken pox. To be fair, it is possible that Gordon did get his scars from being beaten, but if you're going to claim there was a pattern of whipping slaves, you have to show a pattern. Claiming there is a pattern based on only one example is a logical fallacy. I saw an Eskimo with a wooden leg, therefore all Eskimos have wooden legs. What's amazing is, once the Civil War was over, all of the tales of abuse suddenly disappeared. Why? If you can whip a slave, you can whip a sharecropper. But we don't hear stories of sharecroppers being whipped. The fact is, it was all a political campaign, which still influences people's attitudes today. By 1860, slavery was naturally dying out. Many blacks in the South were not slaves. They were free, and owned their own business. They were barbers, farmers, preachers, shoemakers, and merchants. For example, Lunsford Lane of North Carolina made pipes and sold tobacco. Then there were the Southern blacks who did not own their own business, but were not slaves, either. They were bricklayers, carpenters, blacksmiths, bakers, etc., who worked for a living wage, and were not owned by a slave master. However, it was difficult to count the number of free blacks of the South, because only the business owners were considered free men. All others were called slaves. Preventing blacks from voting and restricting travel made it easy to label them as slaves. Lunsford Lane, for example, was still considered a slave, because the North chose not to recognize manumission, which is when a master can free his slaves without government intervention. Southerners who freed their slaves by manumission were accused of releasing blacks on the basis they were unproductive. So laws began to restrict the practice. Does this mean the North did not want the South to set their slaves free? Actually, yes. The North wanted full control so it could appear to be the hero by setting the slaves free, yet keep blacks restricted to the South. Their plan was simple. Step 1. Rename slaves sharecroppers, instead of allowing them to be free to leave the South. Step 2. Claim sharecroppers get 1/3 of a plantation's profits in the form of wages. Step 3. Force them to pay the federal income tax. Here's the tricky part. Counting so many blacks would make each individual's share fall below the $800 minimum, and the plan would fail. Luckily, they could rely on the 3/5 Compromise of 1787. Initially meant to limit the number of representatives in Congress, it could now exaggerate the dollar amount attributed to each individual. As we learned from Schoolhouse Rock, distribution is important. Part 5. War. The South had already seceded because of the unfair tariffs, and was making advancements toward freeing the slaves. For example, in 1850, a mechanical cotton harvester was patented by Samuel S. Rembert and Jebediah Prescott. This machine could do the work of 100 men, eliminating the need for manual labor. The North responded by saying, a mechanical picker would free millions of blacks, allowing them to migrate into northern cities. This machine should be driven out of the cotton fields and sunk into the Mississippi River. So it was withheld from production. The North needed to restrict blacks to the South, and in the 1857 case of Dred Scott, the Supreme Court declared blacks were not citizens, and had no rights according to the federal government. Meanwhile, in the South, blacks were granted their freedom, and even owned businesses legally. These were states' rights, which superseded federal restrictions. When these facts are revealed, it's impossible to claim the South fought to maintain slavery. So I'd like to take a moment to talk about the war. Not the Civil War. The war on reality. The constant attacks Southerners face from misinformed people. First of all, the only time historians use the word invasion is when they talk about the Battle of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, when General Robert E. Lee fought there. They willfully ignore the fact that over 2,000 battles occurred in the South. Ultimately, the South surrendered after so many punishing battles. But Southerners still like to display the Confederate battle flag as a sign of solidarity, similarly to the way battered women like to wear a green ribbon to show the world they are survivors of domestic abuse or rape. You would have to be a disgusting person to rip the ribbon off her, spit in her face, and call her a loser. Yet that's exactly how people act when they see a Confederate flag. They tear it down, set it on fire, and mock anyone who displays it, bragging about the North's victory. They also tear down Confederate monuments out of ignorance, such as statues of General Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee fought against the immoral taxes and tariffs, which all people in the South were forced to pay. This means, while the South was setting black people free every day, Robert E. Lee was protecting them from the Northern extortionists. He also kept black people out of harm's way, by not involving them in Civil War battles. Simply put, Robert E. Lee was the first to declare, "Black Lives Matter." The North began drafting black soldiers, and putting them on the front lines, often without adequate ammunition. For example, the Battle of Fort Pillow cost the lives of 300 black Union soldiers, who were used as pawns to delay the Confederate forces, as Union gunboats approached down the Mississippi River. The Northern threat was clear, so a battle took place. Northern newspapers reported that the Union soldiers surrendered, but were shot down by the racist Confederates. But there's plenty of evidence to the contrary, including the fact that the Union flag, which would have been removed to indicate a surrender, remained waving above the fort. Then there's the all-black regiment who were sent to attack Fort Wagner, where nearly 300 were killed. The movie, Glory, likes to pretend black men volunteered to join the Union Army, but in reality, they were forced to fight. The term, enlisted men, means non-officers, not volunteers. The practice of drafting men into the Army continued until 1973. Part 6. Truth. Many people will claim the word slave is mentioned 80 times in the South's ordinances of secession. But that number comes from all Confederate states combined. The first state to secede, South Carolina, mentioned the word slave 18 times. 4 regarding opinions of slavery or anti-slavery. 3 mentioning non-slave holding states. 2 mentioning slave holding states. 2 regarding the institution of slavery. 2 pointing to its use in the U.S. Constitution, and 5 miscellaneous references, such as Lincoln's half-slave, half-free quote. South Carolina's Ordinance of Secession has 28 paragraphs. I've condensed them for this video, but feel free to read the original ordinance to verify what I'm saying is true. Paragraphs 1 and 2 say, "We are going against the advice of other states, which you like to call slave holding, and have decided to withdraw from the federal union." Here is our list of grievances. Paragraphs 3, 4, and 5 serve to remind the Union why the U.S. withdrew from Great Britain in 1776, in order to govern itself. Feeling Britain's laws and politics were somehow destructive to the U.S., we felt the need to abolish them, declare independence, and write the Articles of Confederation, also known as the U.S. Constitution. With it, we could build our own system of government. Paragraphs 6 and 7 say, "We fought the Revolutionary War, and in 1783, Britain signed a treaty, recognizing our sovereignty. Therefore, the U.S. proved that nations, states, territories, or colonies, do have the right to secede from their mother country." Paragraphs 8, 9, 10, and 11 say the Constitution was written in 1787, but only 9 of the 13 colonies accepted it immediately. It took until May 23, 1788, for the remaining 4 states to accept it. An amendment, saying the states retained the right to be sovereign, was added to remove any doubt about states' rights. Paragraphs 12 and 13 say that deal was fully understood. Any laws not written for the U.S. as a whole were rightfully up to the individual states. Simply put, if everyone was not treated equally by the federal government, the state had the right to ignore the unjust rules and govern itself. Paragraph 14 says, "We feel that 14 states, within the U.S., have failed to uphold their obligations laid out in the Constitution." Paragraph 15 cites Article 4 of the Constitution, which says, "No person, held in service or labor in one state, can be discharged by simply escaping to another state." Many people will use this paragraph to imply South Carolina meant slavery, but service or labor could reference any contractual agreement. For example, someone says, "Pay me $100, and I'll fix your roof." So you pay them to get the needed materials, but they take the money and run, leaving you with no money and a leaky roof. That con artist doesn't get away by simply crossing state lines. And since there is no federal law addressing something like that, that state-level concern must be recognized to allow enforcement unrestricted by a state's boundaries. Paragraph 16 says, "Remember, Article 4 was written in 1788, during a time when many northern states held slaves, so don't give us any of that, the South was looking to hold slaves, jazz." Also, it specifically applied to the new territories that were adopted during the North's expansion into Ohio. Yes, the Constitution did right, we want to have slaves in the newly acquired northern territories. That's what the reference to slavery means in those paragraphs. Paragraph 17 says the rules also apply to a fugitive from justice. For example, someone who robs a store in Virginia doesn't avoid punishment by running to Maryland. Paragraph 18 reminds the Union that these laws were upheld, until recently, when the Union began to vilify the South. It mentions fugitives who were set free, just for crossing state lines. Just the idea of slavery has caused the northern states to completely disregard all other definitions pertaining to Article 4. The rest of that paragraph cites specific examples. Paragraph 19 quotes the preamble, "To form a more perfect union, establish justice, etc." Paragraph 20 says, all states were supposed to have equal protection and equal rights, however a higher tax was imposed on the South. The additional taxes would account for the slave population. This additional tax serves as proof that the South was authorized by the federal government to use slave labor. It was a deal made by, and accepted by, the federal government. Paragraph 21 says that this agreement was broken by the Union, despite the fact that the South paid for it. Furthermore, the North has allowed protest groups to disrupt business in the South. Does this sound familiar? Today, groups like Antifa and BLM riot, burn, and loot while the Democrats do nothing to stop it. Instead, they seem to encourage and support them. Paragraph 22 says these disturbances have been steadily increasing for the last 25 years, and it implies the election of Abraham Lincoln was specifically to give the North the endorsement of the executive branch, thereby subverting the Constitution itself. Paragraph 23 mentions how the Union has granted citizenship to anyone who would willfully support the tyranny of the North. Once again, this sounds exactly like what's happening today, as the Democrat Party brings illegal immigrants into the country. Paragraph 24 says that the North intends to take full control of the government on March 4, and exclude the South from expanding into the West, aka the Common Territory, and start a war on slavery, which simply covers up their intentions to destroy the Southern economy. Paragraph 25, 26, and 27 say that the once fair Constitution will no longer represent fair treatment or equal rights, including the right for states to govern themselves, nor give them any voice in the new government. Effectively, the federal government has become the enemy of the South. We therefore dissolve all ties and allegiances to the Union, and hereby secede. Part 7. Perseverance. Pseudo-historians claim that Southern blacks were fed scraps after the white plantation owner had the best part of a chicken. The white meat. But in the 1800s, chickens looked more like this. They had very little breast meat. The most flavorful meat came from the legs and thighs. The dark meat. Therefore, the cooks ate dark meat, because they were able to select their portions first. Keep in mind that poor white farmers also ate dark meat, but they weren't forced to sacrifice the best cuts to a slave master. So where did this lie originate? During the Civil War, Union troops destroyed many farms in the South. People needed to get creative in order to survive, so people began eating bacon instead of ham. They learned to prepare pig's feet, or they would use meat scraps to stuff sausage casings, creating hot dogs. Ground beef was used to make meatloaf and hamburger. The meat comes from what's left over from better cuts of meat. For all we know, some of it might be from the heart, liver, and tongue of a cow. Thanks to the creative blacks in the South, few people starved to death. Today, people believe the myth that white meat went to whites and dark meat went to blacks. This misinformation is supported by the fact that chickens today are specially bred to produce more white meat. Oh, and here's a fun fact. Dark meat is a result of strength and endurance. White meat is quick-twitch fiber, useful only to flap a chicken's wings, but not to fly. So the next time you hear about a black athlete having fast reflexes, or quick-twitch muscles, you will know he has more white meat in his body than most white people do. Part 8. The language barrier. It's difficult to handle large groups of people without a system. So a typical guidebook would say, new arrivals are given a medical exam, and a bath. Those who carry disease are quarantined. Their old clothes are deloused or burned, and they are issued new clothing. Their hair is cut. They are fed. And people are split into smaller groups. Maybe I'm describing how slaves were handled when they first arrived in America. Maybe I'm describing how immigrants were treated when they first arrived at Ellis Island. Maybe I'm describing how recruits are processed when they join the military. The same events take place in each scenario. Sometimes it's difficult to communicate, so individuals are often handled physically, such as putting baby oil on their skin to help keep the flies off. People who speak the same language would understand the reason behind it, and would be able to do that themselves. Can you imagine how this would be interpreted for those individuals who don't understand the language? They greased us down, just to humiliate us. What if they speak a similar language, but certain words have different meanings? For example, the German word for jewelry is Schmuck. But Schmuck is the Yiddish word for penis or foreskin. So if a Jewish person was told to remove their jewelry before they shower, spritz, that would translate as, I'll cut off your penis and spit on you. What a horrible thing to say. Many times, we only hear one side of the story. To challenge the narrative is considered taboo. But here are a few stories I think are worth investigating. Edward Covey was a farming consultant and an efficiency expert. He used his farm to monitor working conditions and record productivity. He often worked alongside the men, to make sure they took regular breaks and weren't overworked. Then he would report his findings to other farmers, so they would be able to expect the maximum output, without pushing their men too hard. Sometimes, Mr. Covey would step away from the workers, to see if they would continue working without supervision. Those who thought it was a good time to slack off were surprised to find Mr. Covey watching them from behind a tree or crouching in the tall grass. Those workers were reprimanded accordingly. One such worker was a 16-year-old named Frederick Douglass. Apparently Douglass had never done any farm work before, so he was sent to Mr. Covey's farm to learn. One of the first tasks given to Frederick was to collect firewood. He was provided with an ox and a cart. That morning, he headed out to the woods, thinking he would be unsupervised, but we know Mr. Covey must have been watching him, as was his habit to do so. Frederick wasted the entire day, accomplishing no work at all. Then he invented an excuse by breaking the cart and blaming the ox for it. Mr. Covey was angry. He took off his belt and spanked Frederick like the spoiled child he was. But according to Frederick Douglass, Mr. Covey whipped him frequently. At least that's what he claimed until confronted by witnesses. Unable to exaggerate the stories, he began to tell people how he stood up to Mr. Covey, fought back, and ran away. Frederick Douglass described his escape as if he had to run through the bushes at night, and hide his scent from bloodhounds. But in reality, his family gave him a train ticket, and he rode it to a town in Maryland, just 20 miles away. He later embellished that story, saying that if he didn't act like a free man who belonged there, he feared he would be arrested. But the porters didn't care about him. They didn't care about anybody who rode the train, as long as they had a ticket. Once again, we only hear one side of the story, which easily falls apart when we ask for details. Part 9. Fuzzy memories. Sometimes things are different than how we remember them. Here's a scenario. Two boys are playing in a barn. One of them finds a strange item, made of metal. The other boy tells him it's an iron mask, and that if he's bad, the adults will make him wear it over his face. The first boy drops it and runs out of the barn, afraid of such an awful punishment. Years later, he draws a picture of what somebody might look like, wearing that iron mask. But what if it wasn't really a mask? What if it was just a broken pulley? The story he heard as a child was a lie, meant to tease or scare him. Common sense tells us there is no practical use for an iron mask. It wouldn't keep the person from talking, and it would interfere with their work. There are much better methods of gagging someone, using a piece of leather or cloth. This idea of making an iron head cage is ridiculous. But for some reason, that narrative is still expressed today. Historians also suggest that slave men were stripped naked, tied to the ground, and whipped by white slave masters. There are even a few drawings which illustrate that. But they're only drawings. The fact is they are variations derived from a photo taken while a British explorer visited the Congo. This photo shows the explorer witnessing locals punishing a criminal by holding him down and whipping him with a switch. This was a common punishment in Africa, and the British explorer was including it in his report. Abolitionists used those phony illustrations for their anti-slave propaganda. I'm against slavery, but I would never stoop to such political attacks to fight it. Once people learn you've been lying, you lose all credibility, no matter how noble your cause is. Those who suggest slaves worked year-round, picking cotton, are completely unaware that cotton can only be harvested for 4 to 6 weeks. Migrant workers pick apples or oranges by hand, so why weren't they used to pick cotton by hand? Actually, in many states, they were. But slave labor was forced on the South to the point of saturation. This means there was no more room for migrant workers, or tenant farmers, to work in the South. Shoddy bunkhouses, initially meant as temporary campsites for migrant workers, were reported to be permanent living conditions for the poor slaves. Perhaps they ended up to be exactly that, but there's no reason to believe that was their original intention. Here's a sensitive subject: slave breeding. According to the narrative, a plantation owner would occasionally round up his slaves, put them on a wagon, and travel hundreds of miles to a breeding farm in Delaware. The slaves would have a weekend orgy, and be brought back to the plantation where the women would later have their babies. Or in the case of the men, meeting women from other plantations and getting them pregnant. That story has been embellished in order to protect the innocent. It's been suggested that sometimes there were no women from other plantations available, so everyone was forced to wear hoods, and they had no idea they were having sex with their own family members. If all they needed to do was put hoods on, then why waste the trip to Delaware? Just tell everyone that some slaves are coming to their plantation from a neighboring farm, and the hoods are there to protect their anonymity. Perhaps it's all a lie, to cover up the fact that people who live in captivity, such as prison inmates, are likely to have sex with whoever is within close proximity. White people are accused of that all the time. Especially those secluded hillbillies in the South. Apparently, suggesting a black father had sex with his own daughter, as depicted in the movie The Cider House Rules, would be too offensive. That's why historians suggest slaves were forced to breed at gunpoint. People of mixed race tend to blame evil white people of raping their great-great-grandmother, as if she was especially chosen by the rich plantation owner. But what if Nana was getting her freak on with some average white boy who came to the plantation to castrate the hogs? Better still, what if neither event happened? Instead, lighter skin evolved thanks to a change in diet. Africans were introduced to cereal grasses and dairy products which provide vitamins they previously needed to absorb from the sun. Their offspring's skin became lighter in each generation. Consider some foods favored by black people in America today. For breakfast, we eat rice cereal or buckwheat pancakes with maple syrup. There aren't any maple trees growing in West Africa. They're mainly in Canada. Then there's macaroni and cheese, and barbecue potato chips. Potatoes were grown by pale-skinned redheads in Ireland. So ask Kunta Kinte why his grandchildren were so much lighter skinned than him, and he will tell you.
Chris, dummy.
Part 10. The Cotton Gin. Most people picture a cotton gin as a hand-cranked machine, about the size of a microwave oven. They believe that every farmer or plantation owner had one of their own, and cleaned their cotton at home. But the gin we see in the encyclopedia is simply a model, designed to demonstrate how it works. In reality, these gins were as large as moving vans, and were not cranked by hand, but operated by steam engines. The farmers and plantation owners would bundle up their seed cotton, and transport it by wagon to large mills in the South, which held dozens of gins. All of the cotton was ginned in these large machines, and carefully monitored by professionals, in order to ensure consistent quality. After all, cotton was an important source of revenue for America, and it needed to be processed properly. The mills did more than just produce cotton, lint. The seeds were sold to farmers who planted new fields of cotton. Cotton seed was fed to farm animals, and oil could be extracted from cotton seed to be used in cooking, made into lotions and cosmetics, and even become an ingredient in pesticides. The leaves and twigs which were removed from the raw cotton bolls, became compost and was sold as fertilizer for farms and orchards. So ginning cotton was a part of at least three industries: lint, seed, and fertilizer. European countries were the largest purchasers of cotton lint, but the northern states controlled shipping. They bought cotton for 20 cents a pound, and sold it for $1.89 a pound. If the South was allowed to trade with Europe directly, they could have offered cotton at half price, while quadrupling their own profits. Bypassing the North would cause the northern economy to crumble. The South even preferred to buy European steam engines which ran the gins, because those made in the North were low quality, and broke down too often. Then there's the gin itself. Eli Whitney's cotton gin used spikes to separate the lint from the seed and twigs, but those spikes often jammed, and broke the fibers of long staple cotton. Long staple cotton produces fine linen. Short staple cotton produces heavy denim. Why bother growing long staple cotton if the fibers will be broken by the Whitney gins? So the South preferred better, McCarthy gins, made in Britain. These gins had no spikes to break the fibers, but relied on friction to pull the lint away from the seeds and stems without damaging the fibers. The North tried to discourage the South from bypassing them, so they imposed high tariffs on equipment imported from Europe. When that failed, and they learned that the South wanted to sell cotton directly to Europe, they sent warships to block the southern ports. They even occupied southern forts, such as Fort Sumter, in order to maintain control and oppress the South. This was all done well before they decided to make slavery an issue. That negative propaganda discouraged Europe from assisting the South, which meant the North was free to invade and overpower the South's militia.